This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned to the break as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's Money Hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. For more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU. I mean, there's a lot going on here. You got DeepSeek, as you noted, coming in, proving that you can create this distilled, post-trained AI model for, a fraction of the amount that it took to create the original one.
Oh, and OpenAI is very upset that they had their data stolen, that they stole from the rest of us first. They stole that fair and square. That is, let me get out the world's tiniest violin for them.
Welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We are coming to you from Seattle, where we get to report each day on what's happening around us in business, technology, and innovation. What happens here matters everywhere, and every week on this show, we get to talk about some of the most interesting and important stories and trends in the news. This week, it was Amazon earnings week. We got a glimpse inside the state of the company's cloud business and the rest of its domain. And I'm pleased to welcome to the show this week our guest, Corey Quinn. He is chief cloud economist at the Duckbill Group and the mastermind behind Last Week in AWS, the popular newsletter that keeps the cloud industry both informed and entertained. And he also hosts the Screaming in the Cloud and the AWS Morning Brief podcasts. It's great to have you on, Corey.
Thank you. As you can probably tell from a guy with two podcasts, I love the sound of my own voice. Thank you for letting me indulge it.
That's great. Well, you tell it like it is with a sense of humor about Amazon. And so I want to get a sense for what you're hearing from customers and sort of a reality check on some of the things we've been hearing from Amazon. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start with a quote from Andy Jassy and get your take on this.
By all means. I always love the quotes I get from Andy Jassy, such as, how the hell did you get in here? It's a fair question.
So on the earnings call this week, Andy Jassy said,
"We think virtually every application that we know of today is going to be reinvented with AI inside of it, and with inference being a core building block, just like compute and storage and database. If you believe that, plus that altogether new experiences that we've only dreamed about are going to actually be available to us with AI. AI represents for sure the biggest opportunity since cloud and probably the biggest technology shift and opportunity in business since the internet."
Corey, how does that square with what you're seeing and hearing from Amazon's customers these days in their approach to AI and just the cloud generally?
I think that there's a fair bit of hype in the AI space. If you haven't picked up on that, you're asleep at the wheel in a cave, driving through a cave somewhere, which sounds like a lot of companies' corporate strategy around these sorts of things. One thing that differentiates cloud adoption from AI adoption is back when cloud became a thing, I don't recall, maybe I'm misremembering, but it never seemed that folks felt that they were behind in cloud adoption. They moved at their own pace. There are still people today who are adopting cloud, and they're finding a much better and easier experience of it than people moving in 2008 did. But with AI, that's turned on its head. Everyone feels behind. Even OpenAI is freaking out about DeepSeek. You have Amazon and Google so terrified that falling behind one another that they're competing on the easiest thing that they can compete on, namely who can hit Anthropic harder with the money stick. You have Microsoft worried about falling behind Google. Amazon worried about falling behind Microsoft. Google worried about falling behind and that they have something they might not be able to turn off on a whim. That's Google for you. Across the board, it feels like this bubble is built on fear of missing out. What I have not heard from customers is this is actually going to meaningfully change the way that we do X. There are exceptions here and there. I'm not saying there's no value to AI. I am saying that it is overheated in some massive ways. And that's just not me sitting here in the cheap seats throwing peanuts. That's what I'm seeing from conversations I have with folks who spend their careers thinking about exactly these things. I thought I was missing something. Turns out so did they. We're all sitting here going, there's a lot of smoke here. Where's the fire?
There's been this race to invest in new AI capacity. First Microsoft and then Google, they're all announcing these big increase in capital expenditures to build new data centers to have those data centers filled out with all sorts of new chips for training and inference of artificial intelligence models to run and create these AI models. And you saw Amazon this week basically double down on that with the announcement that they're going to be spending more than $100 billion on capital expenditures in the current year. Now, it gets into a little bit of an apples and oranges.
64% was what I saw from Platformonomics as far as how much of that expense goes to AWS. It turns out they also, sell underpants.
Exactly. And toilet paper, I believe. Yes.
Oh, yes. All sorts of growing-related issues.
And by the way, Platformonomics, Charles Fitzgerald, former VMware, Microsoft executive, very smart on this whole issue of capital expenditures. But nonetheless, they are spending more on those capital expenditures for AI than they have in the past. And so you see this effort to really keep up with the hype in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. It takes time and effort to build out a region. People were surprised to learn that an AWS region being spun up is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor before it ever starts serving the first customer. It takes a lot of time, years, to get something from idea to open for business. I also want to point out that they have a large and growing business that does not necessarily touch AI. People talk about AI to the point where it sucks all the oxygen out of the room, but I see it on AWS bills. It's not the dominant force, not by a long shot.
What is? Because, you see AWS and they had 19% growth over the past quarter compared to the same quarter the prior year, it's fascinating. I just got to say, quick commentary here. Wall Street's expectations were 19.3, and then apparently the whisper number, as they say on CNBC, was 20% growth. And the fact that AWS came in just a little bit under 19%, that combined with lighter than expected forecasts for the company overall for Q1, the stock is down 4%. It's just this funny game in the stock market. But 19% growth is 19% growth. It's nothing to sneeze at that scale. Like, what are you seeing?
On an over $100 billion a year run rate business, it's at some point the numbers get so big that there's a limit to how much you can onboard. That said, I'm not going to sit here oohing and ahhing over AWS growth. If they were to pass a law today, or we wouldn't do that, it would be an executive order. But for whatever reason, if suddenly they're not allowed to onboard any new customers for a quarter, the Money Machine would still go burr and they would show growth quarter over quarter simply because the AWS bill in isolation does not get smaller on its own. Even with concerted effort into reducing it, the bill is often larger year over year. It has all the markings of an unbounded growth problem for an awful lot of companies, and that is no small thing.
So when you look at the AWS bill of today, is it just primarily the basics, compute, storage? What are you seeing on the typical AWS bill?
At scale, yes. You still see a majority in most cases on EC2, their virtual machine offering, storage, be it EBS or S3, data transfer, obviously, and RDS, their managed database offerings. Those are the top 5. And you will see them in a variety of combinations, but the bigger the bill gets, the more normalized to a specific bill profile or baseline that you start to see. So you tell me that you're spending $300 million a year on AWS, I could tell you with a pretty high degree of certainty what the shape of your overall bill is. You tell me you're spending $50,000 a month. Oh, well, now it's basically anyone's guess. We have to see the bill to figure out what's going on. How the heck are you spending that much money every month on Amazon Connect? Oh, you're trying to use it as a database. Maybe don't do that.
All right, we are talking with Corey Quinn from Last Week in AWS. He is the chief cloud economist at the Duckbill Group, and we will be right back after this break. This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's money hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. And for more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU.
Are you living paycheck to paycheck? Help is on the way. Lead financial educator for BECU, Stacy Black, is here with me. You have some tips. What should people know?
Number 1, avoid quick fixes like payday loans or pawn shops. They seem like they're going to do the trick, but it just puts us in a deeper hole. And I would say, look big picture, long term. Think about what resources are out there and available to you, and check with your financial institution. I know BECU has a lot of great resources for our members.
What if you are feeling like you're alone? What would you say?
You are not alone. 62% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. And so it's pretty prevalent. Just know that you're not alone and there is help available.
More advice and tips and tricks from Stacey Black, lead financial educator for BECU, is available on Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU.
Listen to the full interview and find more episodes of Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU and find more information at becu.org. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop from GeekWire. Our guest this week is Corey Quinn. He is Chief Cloud Economist at the Duckbill Group. He spends a lot of time helping AWS customers figure out how to minimize their bills, not necessarily reduce their bills, as you're saying, Corey, but to minimize them.
To understand them, honestly, is what it turns into the most. I mean, a significant portion of our consulting work is helping companies negotiate their contracts with AWS. To do that, you have to have a pretty good idea of what the next few years of your cloud usage look like. And I hear a lot of things, but what's interesting to me is what I'm not hearing. I'm not hearing folks saying things along the lines of, well, we spent $100 million over a year on AWS, but we're doing some Gen AI stuff, so better make it $150 million. People are running experiments, but they aren't hurling money into these experiments like there's no tomorrow in most cases. There are exceptions. I have not looked at Anthropic's AWS bill. I'm betting it's high.
Absolutely. And of course, AWS is creating these big superclusters, as I think of them, or maybe as they call them, to train the next versions of Claude for Anthropic, their key partner in that realm. But Corey, I think the bet that Amazon and Microsoft and Google are making is that that gap between present day reality and future potential is going to close over time, and that there's going to be this wave of companies trying to run generative AI as part of every application, as Andy Jassy would say. But it sounds like you're not seeing early indications of that yet.
No, and I don't accept the premise that, once it becomes cheap enough, everyone's going to use it. Because I've been doing this a while. What I see is that you have a continuum. On one end of that continuum, you have efficiency. And on the other end of that continuum, you have innovation. And you have to pick the point on that continuum that you want to be at. When it comes to AI right now, folks are leaning hard into the efficiency side of that continuum. They are not looking to optimize this thing. They're trying to see if it works at all. If the answer is yes, then down the road, as they scale out, then it starts to become something that's a lot more shaped like, can we make this cost effective? How do we wind up reducing our cost to serve every monthly active user, or whatever the metric is you're going for? But today, it's still, is this possible? Does it derive direct business benefit to us by doing this? And I haven't yet encountered a whole lot of folks that are saying, well, we really want to do it, but we have to run that thing 80 trillion times and there's no way we can afford it. That's not the story that's going around there. The question instead is, here's what our company does. How does Gen AI serve to make what we're doing better, faster, stronger, et cetera? And the answer so far has been a resounding, I don't know, but we've got to tell a story about it.
So if I were to ask you about AI agents and whether you're seeing any adoption there, I can imagine what the story might be as well. Am I on the right track?
Counterpoint, I don't want to come across as a doomsayer. I've been working on a couple of projects myself that I'll be putting on the internet reasonably soon. And I don't know how to build web apps. TypeScript honestly feels like it's a prank that Microsoft inflicted on the rest of the JavaScript community. But I found a way to build this thing using generative AI developer assistants. And those, in an agentic way, Windsurf in this particular case, are phenomenal. What I suspect may be happening is they're so good at solving programming language issues that people are mapping that to other realms. But there's a syntactic rigidity to a programming language that human communication does not and cannot possess. So it's always going to be squishier over on that side of the world. The developer assistance is one of those areas where there is a significant clear benefit and value unlock almost immediately. Everything else, it's going to take a bit of time. If you reach out to a customer service representative and instead are confronted by an AI that is not actually empowered to solve your problem, you're not going to be thrilled. People are not happy to begin with when they have to talk to customer service. And the idea that, oh, now we're going to have the robot chat version of a phone tree for you to argue with is not going to make people happier.
Well, one of the places where it seems like Amazon has been getting traction is with the Amazon Q developer assistant and this whole notion of using that to convert legacy applications, maybe mainframe applications or .NET applications into more modern languages that can run in the cloud. Are you seeing that among some of the folks that you work with?
When I was building the stuff that I just was working on recently, I tried 4 different assistants: Amazon Q Developer, GitHub Copilot, Cursor, and Windsurf. And Amazon Q came in as a strong 4th place out of 4. It is not great. It feels like the onboarding flow was rushed to a point of being almost unusable. I wound up not going through the right login flow. Instead of saying, hey, you have to use a different kind of account, it threw a 500 error. Our service is busy. Try again later. What? It was a strange experience. Then when you get in, it starts metering. Oh, you're asking it to go and build a feature. You only get 3 code generations for each time that you do this. Like it's a genie doling out wishes or something, as opposed to infinite refinement with everything else. And you're limited to the number of dev features you can have it work on in a given calendar month, because of course there's a service quota tied to that, despite the fact that you're paying for the thing. So there's this very strange world where I feel like I'm under a ticking clock there. Under the hood, I assume they're all using the same baseline LLMs. All the other 3 that I'm using, I either use or have the option to use Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Amazon Q does not disclose, but the code it does spit out feels, if it's not that, it's something equivalent. So good for them, whatever it happens to be. But it all feels like it's different interfaces to the same underlying ability here. And you can swap out the LLMs fairly easily. They have become commoditized remarkably quickly, which is not great news if you're investing $100 billion in a company to build them, but that's not my problem.
It seems like what Amazon is doing is kind of trying to embrace the commoditization of this whole thing. You saw the announcement at reInvent of Nova, which was in many ways compared to the idea of a store brand or Amazon Basics for AI models. This was their attempt to come in with a much cheaper, yet still very efficient family of models that people could choose. It's kind of like as a safe and less expensive alternative to things like Anthropic's engines.
Sure. One of the things I'm building right now is a free Blue Sky client to go ahead to author Blue Sky posts. One of the things I'm using AI for in this is to spin up alt text for images. And I've been using Claude 3.5 Sonnet to do it through Amazon Bedrock. And that was fine. I tried Nova as well. It was okay. Not as good, but it was okay. The problem that I had by doing this is that it was very much a, does this work at all? I'm going to use the best thing right now to make sure that it works. Down the road, I can go ahead and change it over if I need to cost optimize this, but I want to see if it works. So I picked the expensive one instead of the one that is significantly less money. The last time I checked the bill for these experiments so far, I just crossed the 10-cent threshold, to the point where I am now at, every month now it's going to cost me 10 cents to run this thing. Time to start optimizing that. If I use Nova, I can get it down to a penny. Yeah, it turns out I'm not that interested in stretching a penny to the point of becoming copper wire that I need to do that. Now, if I start servicing millions upon millions of users on this for free, at some point I'm going to need to optimize it, but we're a long way away from there.
What are you seeing in terms of the comparing and contrasting that happens among Google Cloud, Oracle, Microsoft Azure, and AWS as it relates to these kinds of applications? Are your clients going out and shopping around in the multi-cloud marketplace a lot, or how are they playing these companies off of each other?
Everyone tends to be multi-cloud to some degree. It's not, this application needs to run everywhere. It's different workloads run in different places. And generally speaking, people are picking the one that's where the rest of the application is. In the very early days, people were calling out to OpenAI or Azure's expression thereof. As it's become commoditized, I can run Anthropic's models basically anywhere if I want to, because almost everyone sells them. I can also run my own in a variety of different hosted service options. Google has Vertex, Amazon has Bedrock, Microsoft has, I don't even know. It's super efficient over in Azure just because it's apparently not that hard to run things in other people's accounts. Super economic that way. The problem that I'm seeing is that it's not differentiated in any meaningful way. They're all effectively commoditized at the inference LLM layer. Where it starts to get a little bit more differentiated is moving up the stack into GitHub Copilot, and then Microsoft Copilot, it becomes this catch-all brand that distills down to meaninglessness. Google Gemini started off with some interesting things and then became this overall brand that distills down into meaninglessness. And then Amazon Q did the exact same thing. Big brand distills down to meaninglessness, demonstrating that when companies and people are free to do as they please, they generally emulate each other.
I'm talking this week with Corey Quinn. He is chief cloud economist at the Duckbill Group and the author of the Last Week in AWS newsletter. We'll be right back with more. It's Todd Bishop, and I wanted to tell you about a favorite podcast of mine. It's called Booming, and it's a show that has opened my eyes to a whole range of things, like what's really happening when I scan a digital coupon at the grocery store, and how robots are changing the construction of buildings in downtown Seattle, among many other topics. Booming is a podcast from KUOW Public Radio in Seattle. It's about the economic forces shaping our lives in the Pacific Northwest. It's co-hosted by reporters Joshua McNichols and Monica Nicholsberg. That's a familiar name and voice to longtime GeekWire readers and listeners. They answer questions that listeners are wondering about, like why are sports tickets so expensive? Or how hard should you actually work at work? Plus, every episode ends with a game. That's Booming from KUOW Public Radio. Find episodes on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop. Our guest this week is Corey Quinn, chief cloud economist at the Duckbill Group. He is also the author of the Last Week in AWS newsletter and the host of the Screaming in the Cloud and AWS Morning Brief podcasts. So, Corey, when something like Amazon earnings come out, do you pay attention or look for clues there? Or is that kind of at a level that really just doesn't relate to the folks you work with and the work that you do?
Honestly, I pay attention to it mostly out of morbid curiosity. And the earnings calls are fascinating just because you get a little bit more color around things. Yesterday, Andy Jassy mentioned that they had been stretching out a lot of their server lifetimes, and they're now reducing some because of Gen AI was sort of thrown in there from 6 years down to 5 for networking and server equipment usable lifetime. Which, okay, yeah, at some point they do start to fall apart and get carted into the woods by a team of raccoons. But yeah, I understand that you want to stretch it, but you can only do that to a point. That is interesting as far as what it tells me about turnover and refresh of these massive regional buildouts. But that's idle curiosity. They've had the ability to migrate VMs live between different hardware for many years now. And when they have to replace a server, there's no customer disruption as a result. So it's interesting, but from a customer perspective, I could not possibly care less.
Well, for me, it's fascinating in part because AWS represents so much of Amazon's profits at a company-wide level. Just by comparison, it was about half of Amazon's profits in this latest quarter, about $10 billion, came from AWS. And Amazon overall reached a record of more than $20 billion in quarterly profits. When you look at that, is their margin your opportunity in terms of your ability to reduce the bills of customers?
Well, AWS's own margin, it was 37.9% on AWS this last quarter? It's honestly, I think that's mostly data transfer and managed NAT gateways, but that's just a private theory. We don't get to see what the actual margin breakdown is of individual services. I do know that things like storage tend to be rather heavily commoditized and in lockstep with large competitors. More higher up the stack, differentiated business side offerings, that's where you can start charging significantly more. Google Workspace is now, $8 a month for a basic level user? I'm not using $8 a month of compute, storage, and data transfer to get my email. So yeah, there's significant margin baked into that. For we're going to run a virtual machine on top of hardware, you basically know the shape of that. The margins are not going to be nearly as inflated or inflatable.
One of the points that Andy Jassy likes to make is that companies will choose a variety of different AI models when it comes time for that, for different kinds of applications, even for different subservices within larger applications. And that's where Amazon is really, it seems, betting on Bedrock, this whole notion of a marketplace, not only of models from Amazon, but from others. And, they were very quick to get DeepSeek into Bedrock. How do you see that playing out?
I was wrong the last time I weighed in on this. I was convinced that this idea of a multimodal future was sort of ludicrous, that this was not something that was actually going to happen. It was Amazon's story because they could not, for the life of them, come up with a leading frontier model, because it's hard to train one of those things for $8 and a candy bar, which is generally their level of frugality investment for things like this. But when DeepSeek came out, within days, it was on Bedrock. And okay, that was a massive pivot as everyone else starts more or less losing their minds about it. Amazon did very well with the market immediate reaction. Not that I think that's what they should be optimizing for. Let me be clear here. But yeah, they're very well positioned to make that work. And if the trend is going to continue, whereas the frontier model costs $1 billion to make, but then something distilled out of it by some other company costs $1 million or so, well, Amazon's sitting very pretty, except for the minor part of just how hard they hit Anthropic with the money stick when competing with Google.
What do you mean by that last point on Anthropic and Google?
Oh, Google and Amazon have been basically trying to play this game of one-upsmanship, where who can put more money into Anthropic faster.
Got it.
Which I think Amazon has put in $4 billion, committed another $4 billion at last I checked, which I'm not sure if they're aware of this, but it massively erodes any value whatsoever of Anthropic as a customer testimonial. We're going to train our new model on Amazon's Trainium things. Yeah, I will bet you a house that is a contractual term, that of course they're going to have to do it. And there was a keynote given by one of Anthropic's seemingly 40 co-founders at reInvent talking about the fact that they're going to be doing this. Those are almost always part of those contracts. If you'll get a reference of a certain person of this level of seniority to do X, Y, or Z, that is the way that large business deals work. So when you're talking about that many commas buried into this thing that people are going to be hurling money into, all bets are off. I mean, realistically, if they decide to, they can get one of the founders out there dressed as a panda bear.
Understood. Okay. So taking a step back, if you're looking at this landscape, I mean, there's a lot going on here. You got DeepSeek, as you noted, coming in, proving that you can create this distilled, post-trained AI model for, a fraction of the amount that it took to create the original one.
Oh, and OpenAI is very upset that they had their data stolen, that they stole from the rest of us first. They stole that fair and square. That is let me get out the world's tiniest violin for them.
Exactly. So yeah, it's a question of, I guess the origins of the theft, understood. But if you're just the average business IT person, the average startup person, the leader out there, or even just a lowly developer or engineer at one of these companies, like, what are you paying attention to these days in the realm of the cloud writ large, whether it's in AI or other places? Like, what's most interesting to you right now?
Kind of the opposite. Let me give you a perfect example. Yesterday, I listened to the earnings call. I'm a visual person. I read better than I can listen, also faster as well. So how do I get a real-time transcript of these people talking live on a call? The answer, as it turned out, is a tool I use, Audio Hijack by Rogue Amoeba, now has a transcribe option built into it. Using OpenAI's Whisper model, it downloads and runs locally on your machine, and I get that for free for the one-time purchase I made of Audio Hijack. It runs locally. Now, is it actually free? Well, I had to buy a laptop to get started. There's some tiny amount of power it's going to need in terms of money from the course of the day. But yeah, the economics of that have plummeted to effectively zero. What is that going to look like at scale? I mean, Apple is also sitting relatively well positioned here because everyone has a massive supercomputer capable of doing these things now in their pocket that Apple doesn't have to pay on an ongoing basis to run AI workloads on it. On device is better for privacy, obviously, but it's also better for the providing companies margins when they don't have to run all that inference themselves.
I do the same thing on the earnings calls. I use a tool called Otter AI. I don't have a Mac, so I'm not able to use I'm familiar with Audio Hijack. I've used it in the past when I was on a Mac, but on my Windows PC, I go through the browser. I end up using Otter, OTTER.ai. And the thing I love about that is I can see the real-time transcription and then query it in real time as well and say, what did Andy Jassy just say about CapEx? And so that to me is where I'm seeing the value.
But that's a great approach. I'll try it next time.
Yeah.
I'm playing this as I go. I was impressed by the fact that it worked in near real time on device on my almost 5-year-old laptop. It was the first generation of the Apple Silicon MacBook Pro, and it worked fine. So it isn't even the latest bleeding edge, hideously expensive hardware.
Do you see somehow a shift back to local processing and the value of something being on premises with the rise of AI versus it happening in the cloud?
This sine wave has been going on longer than I've been alive, where first you have central processing on a mainframe filled with dumb terminals or thin clients, as the term became back to it. Then you had the wise thin clients, you had big beefy desktop computers. You have fast, exciting laptops, and you have a bunch of people doing cloud development. One of my observations is that remote development is the only way to go. Have all your development done in the cloud, except when new MacBooks come out, at which point local development is the only way to go. And my boss really needs to invest heavily and turn on the spec dial all the way to 11 on the one that I'm getting. Like it's always a bit self-serving. In practice, there are some things that the cloud will never be able to do effectively. Local sensors is a terrific example of this. There's never gonna be an accelerometer on my car that is working in real time in concert with the cloud. There is no good way to have that kind of real time feedback with anything other than on device. And there's other things too. I trust on device data and things to query it with a hell of a lot more clearly. Perfect example of this. Out of curiosity, when I was running one of these LLMs locally, I had a little bit of glee just asking for a recipe for napalm. Whereas if I ask OpenAI and Anthropic, not only will it refuse to answer, but there's a decent chance that I'll wind up on a list for having asked the questions and people kicking my door off the hinges. To be clear, I am not making napalm, but it seemed like one of the interesting things to ask that, will this actually get an answer? And yeah, it will.
All right, Corey, big picture last question here for you. If you were forced to get up at reInvent and give your take on the state of AWS and the cloud industry writ large, I'm not going to make you give the speech, but I'm wondering, what would be top of mind for you right now as we enter the second month of 2025? Where does your mind go?
The big things, the valuable things, the things that drive the world in a computing sense are also, blessedly, the boring things. No one wants to see someone get up on stage and talk for an hour purely about EC2 instances because they're there. People have wrapped their heads around them. They can achieve the outcome they're going to, and those outcomes run the internet as we know it. The higher level stuff is flashy, it's exciting, it's higher margin, but it is in many respects a sales sideshow / pitch for please use these things as well. The big, trustworthy, awesome things, those are there. People almost completely overlooked S3 tables. The fact that S3 buckets now can natively store iceberg tables in them and you can query them. Along with the metadata capability that they launched, people are sleeping on that. And I can't wait to see someone come out with something incredible that paints that very clear. I'm not a data person. I'm a hazard to myself and others when it comes to stateful things. I am professionally clumsy like that. So it's not going to be me, but someone is going to do something transformative with that. And I can't wait to see it because right now, people aren't paying attention.
Sounds like a good startup opportunity there for somebody to go out and launch something super useful with absolutely zero prospect of getting any funding.
I know, it's great, like raising funding. So does your product have an AI pitch? Yes, absolutely. It answers dumb questions like, is there an AI component to your product? Well, it does that. The rest of us are out building things. Yeah, I think that would be a terrific way to raise all the money. Surely that'll work out well.
If you've made it this far, you probably know this, but EC2, Elastic Cloud Compute, S3, Simple Storage Service, sort of the fundamental building blocks of AWS and the cloud, the stuff that 19% growth rate is built on.
Absolutely. I don't have data anymore if it's still the case, but for a long time, EC2 as a service was the majority of AWS spend. Not the biggest one, a majority. Is it today? I don't know. Unfortunately, they don't break that down or, just casually drop that little factoid in random bar conversations after 6 beers with me. But I have the sneaking suspicion that if it's not there, it's damn close. But it's not interesting. It's not exciting. It just works and it's boring.
Perfect.
So why talk about it on stage?
But you can talk about it on a podcast.
Oh, God, yes.
And in a newsletter.
I'm that kind of a nerd. I love that stuff.
That's great. Corey Quinn is Chief Cloud Economist at the Duckbill Group. He is the author of Last Week in AWS, the weekly newsletter, and he is the host of the Screaming in the Cloud and AWS Morning Brief podcasts. Corey, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It is always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. And just a reminder, we had a special episode last week, part 1 of my interview with Bill Gates about his new book, Source Code. We'll have a second installment in that interview coming up next week with Bill Gates talking about Microsoft's 50th anniversary and what's next for the company, the industry, and artificial intelligence. That's coming up next week on the GeekWire podcast. Curt Milton edited and produced this episode. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of the GeekWire podcast.